Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos, and in this video, we have a lot of Shadowlands news to cover that came out very recently. So let's get started with the GCD changes that have been announced here. So Blizzard has removed many burst cooldowns from the global cooldown. So spells categorized as burst cooldowns, stuff like Avenging Wrath or Arcane Power, whose primary purpose is to increase your throughput every 2 to 3 minutes. I think this makes a lot of sense given the reasons why they changed the GCD in the first place to target abilities like this. And if you look at this, almost all of these abilities fall into that 2 to 3 minute range. Notable exceptions like Pillar of Frost on the 45-second window. And also another thing that almost all of these cooldowns have in common is that most specs are not getting more than one coming off the GCD here. Now, this is a lot of cooldowns coming off the GCD, but besides stuff like Balance, which is going to be able to press Celestial Alignment and Ravenous Frenzy, their Venthyr ability, which looks like they're probably going to be playing since the Night Fae one was nerfed. So that is 2 off GCD buttons that can be pressed at the same time, and that'll be powerful. Death Knight, actually Pillar of Frost and Empower Rune Weapon potentially could be used at the same time as well. But besides that, all these other specs, pretty much, there's one per spec coming out at most. Again, maybe Avenging Wrath and Wings and Holy Avenger, but even then, it's not always clear that you want to pop those at the same time for Holy Paladin. So for the most part, this is going to allow them to preserve that element of avoiding us getting to a place where we have 5 buttons we want to press in the same global again, which that was part of the reason that they took away the GCD. Like they put all these abilities on the GCD in the first place, was that they didn't like the pattern of being optimal by pressing 5 buttons in a single global, even if you macro them together as well, which was the correct way to do that in a lot of cases, or at least the easiest way to do that in a lot of cases. It was still this kind of barrier between the way that a class, like it's just a weird thing that caught beginner players, I guess. And so that's why when I made my video about GCD fixes a while ago, I tried to make solutions that would bring back the fluid gameplay that we enjoyed in previous expansions without bringing back that drawback that it seems like was a pretty high priority for Blizzard. And I think that this is a good compromise here, a set of abilities coming back off the GCD that is going to be helpful. I think that the other moves they've been making, such as Mage dropping Rune of Power automatically with major cooldown uses, and then Rune of Power's own CD being increased to compensate, Priest's Rapture coming with a shield up front. I think those are also fantastic ways to fix the biggest pain points of the current GCD system. In fact, I suggested them in my video before they were actually implemented, so I don't know if I can take credit for them, but I'm going to do it anyways. So that, I think all in all, this is GCD moving in a good direction. There's some discussion on like Twitter and stuff about not praising this move because it's fundamentally them giving back something that we already had. But I think you have to keep in mind that like they took the abilities off the GCD for a reason, right? Even if it's not something that affects you, like me as a player, I wasn't bothered by macroing 5 buttons together in a single button. But like, if you can get to that point of respecting that, okay, for whatever reason, Blizzard, this is a problem for them, and there's some players that are impacted by this. I think that the moves they've been making on the GCD front in particular over the Shadowlands beta process have been generally moving us towards a good compromise solution, a solution where, for the most part, we don't get the GCD hell situations that have happened a little bit in BFA. Now, not all specs are fixed by any stretch. There's still a long way to go before I think the GCD will have, will not have further improvements that I would suggest to it, but I think this is a big step. Specs that are potentially still kind of left out in the rain, stuff like Unholy, who's still looking at 20 globals before they can start doing damage, that kind of stuff. A lot of healer specs here actually untouched as well, so could see some potential love being directed towards some of them, and tank specs too. I think that for me the biggest, honestly, even before this fix to the burst cooldowns, the biggest area that I think the GCD is a problem right now is defensive reactive abilities like Frenzied Regeneration for Guardian Druids, Light of the Protector for Protection Paladins. I think that those abilities being on GCD really creates this punishing situation of you have to not do something in order to be ready to use your reactive ability, and by doing that you're falling further behind in your proactive defensive priorities. So you're caught in this really rough spot where you really have to make a good prediction about whether you're going to need Light of the Protector in the next global. And I think that those reactive abilities should come back off the GCD, and the rebalance, whatever rebalance needs to happen around that, is do if necessary. Anyways, that's the GCD changes. That's by far not the only piece of news that we have for today. Let's move on to the next one. Next piece of information we have, this is kind of a follow-up to my video about raid buffs a little while ago, is that the unstable temporal time shifter, the engineering battle res, has been effectively removed. It's capped at level 50 in Shadowlands, so you won't be able to use it as soon as Shadowlands starts, basically. This means that it's not too impactful for a raider. If you raid mostly, or if you do PvP, you already couldn't use it in PvP. And if you were a raider, very rarely was it necessary to use engineering reses in raid. I have used them in raid, but that's because the players in my guild that are playing the battle res specs are largely incompetent. Most guilds have multiple Death Knights, Druids, and or Warlocks, and so there's usually battle res coverage available, and you don't need it. However, in a dungeon setting, this is not anywhere close to a given. In a dungeon setting, it was very common in BFA for groups to not contain one of these three specs in this most recent season, or one of these three classes in the most recent season. In previous seasons, I would say that the lack of engineering battle res really contributed to an insular metagame where it was kind of difficult to, like in season 1, if you were trying to play and you were not a restoration druid, you were in a really rough spot. Like, you needed to have a balanced druid in your comp, or you were going to be left without a really good way to get access to a battle res. Or, of course, back in season 1, blood decay was also a good thing. So there were ways to get battle reses at various times, but there were also these groups that you would join where, like, okay, your tank's like a brewmaster, and there's 3 DPS already that don't have battle reses, and the prospects of getting into that group as something that's not a Resto Druid are close to zero because of how important that battle res was. Now, as we moved on to later seasons in BFA, the engineering res has kind of allowed there to be compositions that don't contain a battle res, and that's been particularly valuable for high-end teams this current season because there are a lot of good team compositions that do not include a spec that brings a battle res naturally. So that's stuff like, like the Holy Paladin, Prot Warrior, Demon Hunter, Rogue, Mage, that kind of composition that has been doing really well in BFA Season 4. That's a composition that, if this were added back in, we probably would have just never seen the Holy Paladins really get to play the high keys in BFA, because the Resto Druid, the difference between, like, the value you get from the Holy Paladin, not worth giving up on the prospects of battle reses entirely. That is, I think this is going to be a negative thing for Mythic Plus. Now, I don't actually think we're going to feel it too hard in Shadowlands Season 1, because my belief is that actually these 3 specs are kind of already meta. So groups that are trying to play at a high level, I think, are pretty likely to contain maybe 2 or more of these on average. I think that Balanced Druid and Warlock, for instance, because they're uncapped AoE specs, are extremely likely to be already some of the few specs that are good in the DPS slots for the high-end groups. And Unholy DK actually is another spec that it's received some capping from Shadowlands, and Shadowlands is scaled quadratically, and those quadratic scalings were brought back down to linear scaling, which is still just as good as any other spec is getting at scaling in AoE. So they still scale into AoE better than, everybody's been cut down a notch, and they were at quadratic and go down to linear. Many specs that were linear have fallen to no scaling above 5 targets. So Unholy DK is still good from that aspect. So anyways, basically, I think that for most top groups, you're probably not going to be impacted by not having a battle res. But if you are trying to play a group with some off-meta comp that doesn't include these specs or these classes, I don't know, it's such a brutal insult to injury to just not have that battle res in your group for high keys. Now, it's not really something you're going to feel if you're doing lower keys. I make a lot of videos on my channel where I try to make the argument that what happens in high-level groups trickles down to what happens in low-level groups. With battle res, I think that's a lot less of a thing. I think the engineering res is really mostly a high-level phenomenon where it was relevant, because in low-level groups, it tends to be true that you can wipe and not have it be as big of a deal. It tends to be true that the kind of battle reses are a little bit less of a resource that gets heavily taxed. It tends to be less true that your group is playing 10 dungeons per day, and the difference between depleting 4 of them and depleting 6 of them is those 2 battle reses, right? Which is, I think, very much a phenomenon that's true for the high level teams. So this is, I hesitate. I don't want to claim that this will affect 10 to 15 keys. Like I do think that some of the other things that I've been critical of will, but I do think this will be a serious limiter on diversity in teams in high level pushing. All right, let's move on to talking about potions. Many old potions no longer work above level 50. So here's a list of those potions. Skystep, Lightfoot, a boatload of potions that I did not know about. I guess Draenic free action potion. That's and presumably the Draenic version, right? There's Draenic living action. Is that on here? I assume that's got to be on here as well. Even if it's not listed here, because that one does the same thing. Oh, this one does not remove. Yeah, the Draenic living action potion is even better because it does remove stuns. You can use it while you're stunned and it'll break you out. All of the previous expansion invis pots, so Draenic, Dimitri's draft, Skaggle drink, basically any potion that was seeing play in Shadowlands at all for utility situations has been made so you can't use it in BFA. Any of these potions that were being used in BFA for utility situations, not making it into Shadowlands. I actually think that this is a very reasonable thing to do. I think that if you're getting into Mythic Plus and you kind of are, I think it's a very daunting prospect to be getting into Mythic Plus and just have this like laundry list of like, all right, you need this potion from Cataclysm, this elixir from Mist of Pandaria, these potions from Vanilla, because in Temple of Citralis, there's a room where you want to be holding some purification potions, and this is true. Like if you're playing without a poison dispel and you're going into Merechtha's room in Temple of Citralis, it's really nice to have a purification potion so you can remove 1 stack of that. It's a good use of your potion CD. So on the one hand, there was some skill intensiveness to using all of these different potions well, but on the other hand, it was pretty clunky, and it was a pretty arbitrary knowledge, requirement in addition to the skill in order to use these well. So I think it makes sense to just not bring the previous expansion's potions into the new expansion and just make a new set of potions. Ideally, then you get this kind of larger space of you can make some cool utility potions into that expansion. Now, on top of this change, we have Skystep and Lightfoot nerf. So Skystep and Lightfoot were two functionally identical potions that gave you 150% movement speed. In Shadowlands, where you're getting the potion of the Psychopomp's speed, which is a 70% version. So it is about half as effective as Skystep or Lightfoot was. I think that this is also reasonable. I think that the Skysteps and Lightfoots were actually overwhelmingly the correct potion to use in Mythic Plus, if you were looking at it the way that things were currently set up. And I think that it makes sense to nerf them. I think it makes sense to bring them into line such that you're actually maybe using DPS potions in Mythic Plus again in a high level setting, because it really, even in BFA, it didn't really make sense. And there you were only locking yourself out of potioning for a minute. It didn't really make sense for tanks, for instance, to use throughput potions. And even for DPS, I think it was frequently a mistake to lock out your ability to use Skystep or Lightfoot. These potions were extremely powerful. So I think nerfing them, I think that this potion of Psychopomp Speed is still going to be useful and still going to be correct to use at certain times, but probably brings it about into range, maybe a little bit below, but honestly, I think people are still underestimating how powerful 70% movement speed for 8 seconds is. That's basically, that is still a very serious utility potion that's worth considering. So I don't think that this is an unreasonable nerf either. I think that I hope that they make the potion decisions in Mythic Plus are interesting and close, and I actually think that this brings us more towards that than away from it. I think that it was going to be correct to Lightfoot or never use a potion so that you wouldn't lock yourself out of Lightfooting for the next 5 minutes. I also think that this change it goes a long way towards this kind of weird phenomenon of the new invis pots, for instance. I think were used at a far lesser percentage than, say, Skaggle Drink, because just Skaggle Drink was cheaper to make, it was cheaper to have, so you just make those and they did the same thing. So instead of needing to power creep the old invis pot to get you to use the new expansions one, they can just tell you, all right, you got to use the new expansions one, right? And that, I think, goes, I'm not a WoW economy expert, but I think that's going to do good things for the ability to make money off of professions in like off of alchemy, for instance, now that you can actually craft relevant potions from the current expansion and not just be using the same ones that were already used in the previous expansions again. So all in all, I'm actually favorable about this whole change here. This one is the most controversial, and I think it's because Lightfoot and Skystep were fun. And I understand that. I definitely understand that it is fun to pop a Lightfoot potion and zip around, but I also think that it's fair to adjust the balancing level of the speed potion from expansion to expansion. I think this is a great time to do it. So that's my thoughts on the various pieces of Shadowlands news that we have picked up today. I hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to like it and subscribe and stuff. And I will see you in the next one. Bye.